Good morning. It's always a strange feeling saying good morning to a virtual audience, because you're never sure whether there are 100 people or one person, and whether they're doing something else at the same time as watching the video. So good morning, I'm John-Bugeja, Managing Director, Trade Advisory Network. My pleasure today to be asked to moderate this session. And the session is, just to read its proper title, Future-Proofing SME Supply Chains in Emerging Markets. So I guess there's three aspects to that, fairly obviously. One is future-proofing, so what does that mean? SME, we're going to focus on SMEs, and we are going to focus a little bit on emerging markets. We will have a broader discussion about digitization, because it's really all part of the same theme. So on that subject, before I ask my panelists to introduce themselves, let me just give you a bit of context to digitization. I think everyone understands now what digitization sort of means, and we can see the long-term benefits in terms of efficiency, both in the physical world and the financial world, and the linkages between the two. So that's pretty clear to most people. It's a good thing. Financial inclusion is another potential benefit of digitization, which means providing or giving access to finance segments of the corporate world that previously have lacked that access or struggled to find access, or it's just too expensive. But there's also an inclusion element on the other side, on the lender side. So the traditional model of the banks lending lots of money to lots of customers and having an exclusive role to play in that world. That's already changed, but that will change more with digitization. So inclusion there means other investors, non-bank investors, family offices, pension funds, you name it. It's pretty unlimited. Obviously, a good focus of this whole event this week is ESG, and digitization is pretty much a prerequisite. To a degree, it's a prerequisite. It's difficult to deliver the ESG objectives if you're dealing with lots of paper. The data is not easily accessible, it's not easy to manipulate and use, and the use of paper is itself not terribly green, and it's prone to fraud and manipulation and so on. So digitization is important from an ESG perspective, but when you overlay the ESG objectives onto a digitization agenda or a digitization strategy, you are at the same time adding another layer of complexity to the whole process. So you're making it harder, but for a sort of good reason. When we talk about future-proofing, I guess what we mean by that is that the stakeholders involved in this whole process are all scared that they're going to embark on the wrong path. They're going to ride the wrong horse, and they'll ride it into oblivion, and then find everyone else has gone in the opposite direction, riding a camel. Or sorry, it's a slightly strained analogy there, but you get the idea. So what do we mean by future-proofing, and what steps can be taken in the short term that head in the right direction that deliver actual benefits? So that's sort of what we're talking about for the next 45 minutes. So let me ask my panelists to introduce themselves. So we've got an additional panelist today, which is great. So Rebecca is joining us, but if we just go through, on my screen it's sort of clockwise. So we'll start with Lionel, then Ian, then Rebecca, then Gunnar. So if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yes, thanks, John. So my name is Lionel Taylor. I'm I was going to say the other half of the pantomime horse, which is the way that John and I normally describe our activities as Trade Advisory Network. But, you know, within this context, we are involved in supporting banks, associations, multilaterals and others in terms of their digital strategy and ESG strategy. Often they both go hand in hand, although in some ways they're quite separate.
Okay, thank you. And just to be clear, I'm the end of the horse that eats, by the way. Ian.
Thank you, John. Everybody, pleased to see so many people on the call. My name is Ian Sayers, and I am the Senior Advisor for Access to Financing Investment at the International Trade Center. ITC is a United Nations agency which is responsible for sustainable trade and enterprise development across the world, and we work in about 120 countries. John, you've been calling them emerging markets. I think they refer themselves as emerging markets or developing economies. these days. And so that means we're working with thousands of smaller enterprises, which are the suppliers into international supply chains.
Okay, thank you very much. Rebecca, you really need no introduction, but go ahead anyway.
Well, I'm Rebecca Harding. I'm the Chief Executive of Coriolis, and welcome to this event. I think that's all I'll say.
Thank you very much. Gunnar.
Hi everyone, Gunnar-Collin. I'm Head of Sales and Marketing for, I should say, a small company, a small tech company in Sweden. And we do one thing and we do one thing only, and that is digital paper. And you might think that that is sort of not a very important thing, but if you think again, if there is a possibility to have a digital paper that actually performs the same way as its paper equivalent, you can do very, very many things in the digital space without having to go through sort of changing your processes or buying big systems or engage in closed networks. So this is really what we are all about, digitizing the very, very basic of sort of the paper or documents flows that are sort of currently in use.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, actually, we are missing one panelist who may or may not join us later on. Obviously, we're slightly delayed. That's Pedreira.
Joined already, John.
As if by magic.
Sorry.
As if by magic. You no idea what I was going to say about you there, Duarte, but never mind. Really quickly introduce yourself.
Of course, John. I'm Duarte Pedreira. I head up emerging frontier markets at Crown Agents Bank, or CAB. What we do essentially is to facilitate inbound and outbound flows into and out of emerging frontier markets, with a big focus on foreign exchange trading and also last mile delivery, whether it's to a bank account, ACH system, or mobile money. Of course, trade finance is also an important part of that, particularly in flows originating from emerging frontier markets. Delighted to join you all and look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's kick off with a little focus on SMEs, particularly those in emerging or developing markets. So Ian, let's start with you on this, as it's very much your focus. What are the challenges that SMEs face, in particular, in joining this digital revolution? We know they have challenges in accessing finance. That's been talked about a lot through Asian Development Bank, ICC surveys, and so on. But what are the challenges that obstruct them in joining the digital revolution, in your view?
John, well, thanks for that introduction. Look, in Glasgow the last few days, we've heard a lot about ESG and moves by major corporates to try and improve environmental sustainability along their supply chains. But one interesting statistic that we should bear in mind is that along those supply chains, most suppliers the majority of suppliers are based in emerging markets or developing economies. We know that those suppliers, 80% of them, at least, are what we would call SMEs. And it is in those areas where you have the biggest risk. If we look at all of the sort of history of reputational damage and ESG supply chain sort of crises, which we've seen in the world, most of those have happened upstream in supply chains. I'm thinking palm oil, I'm thinking textiles and garments industries. Most of you online here will understand what I mean. So even though we have this focus on improving ESG and supply chains, we seem to be missing the point that somehow these smaller enterprises, which are the main suppliers to the world, need to adapt. And in order to adapt, they're going to need to find financing to help them do that. And it is in these countries where the costs of financing and the collateral requirements extracted for regulatory purposes are highest. And so I haven't heard anything coming out of Glasgow yet about what we intend to do at in that part of the supply chain. And so this is an area of focus for ITC and our access to financing investment activities at the moment. How can we cut the regulatory collateral? How can we cut the costs of financing for SMEs, particularly trade-related financing? And more importantly, how can we help them overcome one of the big factors in the friction of financing and international transactions for them? And that is the subject of today's discussion, which is all about how can we help them digitize their documentation and actually now get the ESG ratings they're going to require to comply with import market requirements.
So in essence, they've got two finance problems. They need finance to actually trade, and they need finance to join the digital revolution and to I guess, be able to certify themselves or become certified, which will be an increasing requirement going forward.
Yes, thanks. Look, I mean, if we look at the costs of sustainability or social inclusion certifications, if they are going for, or if they are asked by their buyers to go for a scheme which requires some kind of audit, on average, the cost of these audits are between $4,000 US per year or per audit. Yeah. And in some cases, we have suppliers sort of in the footwear industry, particularly running shoes, which are actually looking at needing 4 or 5 different audits in order to satisfy each of their international buyers, and the prices, you know, the costs just mount up, and they're looking at approximately $100,000 a year. So this is another factor to bear in mind.
Okay, so we'll perhaps come back to how the stronger players in the supply chain can help in a second, but let's just explore this theme a little bit further, perhaps broadening it to digitalization or digitization more generally. So Duarte, what are your thoughts on the challenges facing SMEs, particularly in emerging markets, developing economies, but actually SMEs generally have a problem with this, don't they?
Yes, but I agree with Ian entirely. I think SMEs, especially in emerging markets, they're quite prone to adapting the digital agenda. The biggest issue is around financing. So we need to turn the dial a little bit. So if we think, for example, and we're talking about SMEs, but we could even go to micro enterprises. You know, you go to many parts of Africa, and the ladies on the street selling vegetables have adhered to the digital revolution by accepting payments through mobile money. And of course, you can go anywhere in, say, Kigali or Nairobi by paying for your taxi with mobile money again. So it's not for lack of willingness. Now, the financing issue is definitely a problem, and of course, you know, reading the widely disseminated surveys around trade finance gap, the problem still seems to be the same. You know, we're talking about how do we onboard and how do we credit assess an SME. So I think it's more around banks and regulators creating the necessary infrastructure. Things like, for example, open banking that will then enable lenders to assess SMEs on the back of their cash flows and their bank statements, rather than questionable tax declarations as such that always tend to be subdued from a profit point of view. And in terms of the onboarding is the same situation, isn't it? It's creating ways and means in which SMEs can be seamlessly onboarded by again using digital solutions, particularly around DLT and blockchain.
Okay, so we know that SME suppliers in markets all over the world tend to deal with multiple buyers, so they're not a member of one single supply chain. They're a member of multiple supply chains, different buyers. Those big buyers maybe have lots of different banks, lots of different schemes that they're operating to try and help support or finance. So how can we address that issue? I mean, we're an SME and we have one bank relationship. The idea that we're going to be onboarded onto multiple platforms in order to service our buyers here in the UK is sort of pretty unthinkable. If you translate that into an SME's position in an emerging or developing economy, where do they get the bandwidth? So Lionel, what do you think? How can we potentially address that problem of these SMEs who are by and large owner managers, don't have lots of technical specialist in-depth skills in different disciplines of business management and finance, working in multiple supply chains, and nevertheless get them to join the digital world? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I agree with everything that Ian and Duarte has said, but I think there's something else that's going on. And I talk from someone who's been visiting some of these SMEs in Southeast Asia as part of some of the work that we do. And I mean, they are owner managers in the main. And I remember visiting an SME in China that was actually turning over $1 billion. It was still called itself an SME. So they do vary in size. But to me, what I found is that these guys are willing to do anything that builds their business and makes them money. Mm-hmm. And that profit motive is quite strong. Most of them have come from backgrounds with very little money. So suddenly they're making money, they're private enterprise, etc. And they get that bug. So I think the incentives are quite key. We can do everything in terms of digitization, in terms of creating standards, but they have to be incentivized. And some of that is carrot and stick. There's no doubt, if you don't have the right ESG kite mark or whatever, and I'm sure Rebecca can talk about that later, then the fact is that the buyer can't join that supply chain. Mm-hmm. So and the way you present that to an SME is very simply saying, if you wish to get more business, you need to have this standard, and you will find that they will adapt and they will go for it. And funny enough, they find the money to do it. Mm-hmm. I don't believe in some of the markets these SMEs are as poor as they like to make out, and as we sometimes believe. So I think that it's about incentivization. I think the tools are there. If they see it developing more business for them, they will join and they will do it. They will find a way. And yes, there'll be cheats. Mm-hmm. I mean, I know we talk about greenwashing, and I've been on listening to the Corollas event all week, and it's been fantastic, as well as some of the COP26 stuff and what have you. Everyone is worried about cheating. Mm-hmm. But it's almost an excuse, not to do anything, because we can't get everything right. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes it's a case of just getting started and getting going. And we're seeing this with some sectors where the suppliers are reacting. And, we've seen this in our early days when we were helping one of the multilaterals onboard suppliers onto the program. They had cheaper pricing if you met certain social standards, with your workforce, that they were in dormitories that were the right state, etc. I think you're right, though. How many platforms do they need to join? They'll join whatever they need to join to do business. Mm-hmm.
So Gunnar, how can technology help smooth that path to make it easier or less intrusive for SMEs to operate with multiple buyers in multiple supply chains, do you think?
Yeah, so first of all, very interesting points from everyone. I would like to sort of revert a little bit to what you said, Duarte, really around technology and sort of the level of technology maturity. And I think the very interesting point in time we are in today is that sort of a mobile connection and the internet is available in many places and for many parties. And having said that, I think sort of the next piece of the puzzle, especially in this context, is to making sure that whatever you are doing and whatever you are dealing with, that you can do it in a safe and a secure way. Because today we actually rely on paper, because most of the things are still paper-based, and as it has been mentioned here, it's prone to fraud and you cannot really trust. But there is actually technology available today. So if you only have a mobile phone and you have access to the internet, you can actually sort of create, manage, and interchange digital documents without having to, as I mentioned previously, join a specific platform or store your data in a specific place. You can actually create and manage documents the way you are used to, but instead of having them in the briefcase with you at all times, you can actually store them safely on your mobile device. Mm-hmm. And this is not very, well, it's sort of complicated technology, but it's very much used, and it's very cheap and it's very available.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we'll perhaps come back to that, but let's just change gear slightly. Rebecca, maybe turn to you. So practically, in the real world, what can banks, the big banks and the anchor buyers, as we call them, do that's actually practical, that can help these SMEs to start making progress? How can they actually promote this in a practical way?
So I think the short answer to that is keep it simple, stupid. I think one of the things that has been really, 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 and I quote President Clinton, not that I'm not saying anything about your red lighting behind you or anything, but the important thing for SMEs is that yes, they have access to technology, yes, they have access to their own markets, but the connection between supply and demand isn't there. And to Gunnar's point and Duarte's point about the technology and about the capacity to participate in this world, back in 2005, and that feels like another lifetime, and it feels 100,000 years ago, I remember the chairman of British Telecom at the time, Ben Verweyen, standing up and saying, it takes a dog, a chair and a computer to participate in the global economy these days. The dog to wake you up in the morning, the chair to sit down on, and the computer to engage in the world of work. And he was absolutely right. And that was 2005. And we were seeing then the, sort of, if you like, the white heat of globalization taking off. And we were beginning to realize what the emerging world could do in all of this space. And the sad thing from my point of view, watching all of that as somebody who's watched innovation from the background all this time, is that we haven't managed to include the emerging world in technology in the way that we should have done. So I think from a bank's perspective, it's learning how to talk SME. And so multiple platforms, the big problem with multiple platforms is that every single SME has to do exactly the same thing. They have to fill in tons of forms. They have to provide all sorts of documentation that isn't necessarily there, that they don't have access to. They can't necessarily run 5 years of audited accounts. They've got to do some self-assessment. There is technology out there to do all of that. For example, integrating accounting systems into an SME solution, integrating credit scoring systems, and better AML and KYC and ESG scoring systems. And that's exactly what we're trying to do, because it keeps things simple in one place. And to the point about incentivization, which Lionel was making, it means that the SME actually wants to fill in this form, because at the end of it, they get a score that's authenticated, and Gunnar can talk more about that, of course, but that's authenticated, and that then gives them an ESG score, gives them an AML KYC score. It shortcuts the process of onboarding for the bank, so that it's made the market accessible by making it cheaper. And the message is really, really simple. These things can all be automated. They can all be done. The data's out there. And one of the things that came out of conversations yesterday was that that people thought the data wasn't there. They're wrong. The data is there because we all know companies trade a product or a service. Very simple. And if they trade a product or a service, then there is a code attached to that product or service, which matches to what they're putting on a lorry, what they're putting on a train, plane, boat. It matches to absolutely everything, meaning that they can score these things very simply. We can score those things very simply. And that then means, of course, that if you get a simple score, you can score it for the distance it's traveling, you can score it for the type of product it is, the supply chain, and so on. So I think the banks need to come on and accept that ESG is a problem. The emerging markets are not necessarily problems, they're opportunities. It's a huge opportunity. And that keeping it simple is the best way of going about it.
Okay, thank you. So you've covered a lot of interesting areas there. So one we'll come back to. You mentioned, or actually Lionel mentioned the G word earlier, not green, silver, greenwashing, which I think links into some of what you just said. Let's just park that idea for a second, and we'll come back to that. In other words, how to avoid it, how to make this information reliable, and just focus a little bit on some of the other issues around digitization first. And you mentioned Bill Clinton, and if we learn anything from Bill Clinton, it's that language is important, and it's important to be able to say what you mean and mean what you say, and definitions are important. I don't think we need to delve into that discussion too much further, but that does bring us onto the legal certainty. With paper documents, there is a high degree of legal certainty as to how a particular document we treat it. I'm talking particularly about documents which confer rights upon the holder. So documents of title, negotiable payment instruments, and those sorts of things. And I guess going forward, certificates as well for various things. So the laws globally are gradually changing, very, very slowly, but probably more quickly than any of us dared to hope. Following the UNCITRAL's model law on electronic transferable records. So we already have Singapore, Bahrain, Abu Dhabi, one other I can't remember. The UK is quite close to changing the law. So we have a situation where a digital original document can perform like a paper document, but that still leaves stakeholders with some difficult decisions about which horse do they jump on. Are they going to be a first mover or an early? So how do we exploit this legal reform in a way which keeps the options open? Let's start with Ian on that, see what your thoughts are.
John, thank you. Look, we've had quite a lot of experience in the countries where we work about attitudes to this question and to governance. And I think it's kind of tied up a little way, the governance, the big G in ESG, and also this question of trustworthiness of documentation, which we all have to work with at the end of the day. So let me relate to you one piece of learning, which also ties in with this kind of the difference in language between financing providers and entrepreneurs. And so in Africa, Afreximbank designed a wonderful system in association with other banks called Mwanza, which allowed enterprises to effectively park their business documentation, beneficial ownership, directors' information in a vault that was with Afreximbank. They've kind of avoided it. This is basically what you can say. And there's a sort of antipathy, if you like, amongst entrepreneurs to move anything that they have outside of their own space where they can touch it digitally or in paper. So I think this is where the type of systems that Rebecca has been working on are referring to. They really come into play. And Gunnar, the concept of digital paper allows enterprises to, in a way, feel that they're still in control of their documentation, whilst at the same time having it in an immutable format that can be trusted with time. And I use those words quite carefully, because if we look at the underlying intentions here, which is really what matters, you have a bunch of suppliers whose livelihood depends on making good trade transactions that are profitable and that work, okay? And they want to build up their reputation. This is generally the philosophy, if you like, by which they live. So their intention, they're not necessarily setting out to game the system unless we introduce all sorts of financing incentives that would encourage them to do that. Mm-hmm. So if we're looking at the plain underlying transactions between suppliers who have been in business for a while and buyers, they're actually not that high a percentage of bad fraudulent transactions compared with the global total. So our view is that so long as you keep it simple, so long as the entrepreneurs believe they retain possession of their documentation and control over it and do not have to subscribe for a proprietary system, then you've got the basis for something that's going to work.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's interesting. I think just thinking about what it feels like to be an SME, SMEs don't have a large IT department, and they don't employ. If they don't have any, they've got the same person that makes the tea is probably trying to fix the laptop as well, and they don't employ an army, and can't afford to employ an army of lawyers. So when we talk about the law changing and digital documents becoming usable in a way which replicates paper, and is conceptually and intellectually the answer. I mean, it's clearly, it makes things possible which wouldn't otherwise be possible. But they are nevertheless, there's millions and millions of SMEs, and they don't have that knowledge. They don't have access to those skills. How do they get on board with this whole idea of moving to digital original documents? So I'll come to Gunnar in a second on that, because obviously that's one of the things your business does. But Duarte, what are your thoughts on that? How do we make it real for an SME, given there are millions of them and they don't have the skills or resources to really get to grips with this?
I'm normally one not supporting an intervention state, but in this particular instance, I think legal reform, and particularly in emerging and frontier markets, is absolutely necessary. I think, let's think about Africa for a second, because it's really a great example for a playground where this can take shape. We're now looking at the advent of the ACFTA. So one of the things I wonder is whether the ACFTA can, or the Africa Continental Free Trade Area or Agreement, can take a larger remit to actually create the conditions to enable a sort of payment service directive, but without the drawbacks of the PSD, insofar as and maybe perhaps adopting something like the Indian model, which has proven to be much better, but to enable this open banking conversation. And I think what emerging market governments should be looking at is very much like, the lack of fixed telephony forced them to leap into mobile. I think the antiquated legal systems can become an opportunity just to tear down and start again from a blank canvas point of view. So, in answer to your question, I do think that this infrastructure can be created centrally and then just plugged in a seamless and easy way for the SMEs to use via the financiers in particular.
Yeah, so are you thinking in terms of an infrastructure as in a legal framework and guidelines, or an infrastructure as in a mega computer?
Legal framework and guidelines, because I think the mega computer then can easily be developed by the financiers themselves. Again, in this And the financiers and the fintechs, as it's happening perhaps in Europe and the US and so on with the open banking discussion, where you have these aggregators, and then the cream of the crop of financial services can be offered, including marketplaces for receivables discounting, supply chain finance, can be offered at a touch of an app. So the SME needs the app, right? So because, as you said, they don't have these complex IT departments and that infrastructure. They need it to be delivered, as one of our fellow panelists said, in a stupid simple way. And for that to get to that stage, it needs all that institutional and governmental backing, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think the idea of the app is very, very good. I mean, businesses are getting younger, and the people following our footsteps, by and large, have grown up with using digital technology, and the idea of reverting to bits of paper is pretty weird to them. I've got 4 boys between the ages of 25 and 32, and they have varying degrees of technology awareness, but they don't really deal with paper, that's for sure. But the app without the legal infrastructure would mean multiple rule books, which again exposes the SMEs to a legal challenge, because they're signing a rule book, they're signing a contract. So multiple rule books to me don't seem to be the answer, but a legal framework coupled with an open app type of approach, which means that if you need that to access a particular service or solution with regard to digital documents, you can do that because you're protected by the law, you've got legal certainty, but you don't have to sign up to 15 different rule books because of your multiplicity of supply chains. So let's come back to Gunnar on that, because that's your stock in trade, really. So how easy is it to apply and implement a digital original document solution if the legal framework were there, which admittedly it isn't yet in many, many markets, but if it were there, how easy would it be to actually use the digital original document technology?
Fairly easy, I should say, because as it replicates sort of the paper document, you would recognize sort of the processes, you would recognize how to exchange documents, you would recognize how to update a document, how to sign a document, because everything will look the same as it does in the physical world. The only difference is that it will be digital. So that wouldn't be that hard, as long as you sort of are comfortable with sort of a digital solution, if you wish. And obviously, as you say, if the legal framework is there and if it's understood, then that would be fairly easy. Can I just revert a little bit back to sort of your question around your question to Duarte on if he was referring to sort of a legal framework or a big machine. Because if you dig it a little bit deeper, I wouldn't say that there is a big machine available today that can keep track of everything, but there is technology available, and if we just go a little bit sort of using the blockchain technology in a good way, you will always in any point in time have a certainty of sort of a digital record, because that can be proven mathematically on the blockchain. That doesn't mean you have to put your data on a blockchain, or that doesn't mean that you have to transact on the blockchain, because that would require sort of too much waste of energy, and that is extremely counterproductive. But if you use it in a smart way and only as a notary service that is open for all at all times, then you will at any point in time have the certainty. And that is, if you wish, not sort of the machine, but it's sort of the framework that will make everything work smoothly.
Okay, thank you. Now, just conscious of the time, so I've got two more sort of areas to cover before we run out of time. So, Rebecca, let's come back to you and talk about greenwashing. If I'm being devil's advocate for a second, anything which requires self-certification is to me likely to be susceptible to malpractice of some sort or exaggeration. So, how do you avoid that? How do you avoid the greenwashing?
I think by keeping things simple, and I think that's a very simple answer to what you've just said. The truth is that a lot of the solutions, particularly on ESG, that are out there at the moment, number one, don't apply to emerging markets because the small companies in emerging markets can't necessarily answer the types of greenwashing questions. You know, what's your carbon emissions? How many bits of paper do you chuck in recycling? You know, all of those types of things. Do you have a sustainability policy? No, well, some businesses may have this, but it's going to be extremely difficult to find the businesses across emerging markets who are in the informal economy who actually have those types of policies. So you can't do it. So let's throw all of that potential for greenwashing out of the window. Now, I'm an economist, as you know, and economists are quite good at reducing things down to their bare basics. So this is a piece of sort of strategic reductionism, if you like. But what I'm doing is saying every single company trades a product, and we can match those products against sustainable development goals, and we can match those products against various taxonomies that are beginning to come out, including those that will be the result of the decision on deforestation in COP, including those that are about methane production and so on, because we can look at the sectors and match the companies' product profile, if you like, against those sectors and how they're treated. That's done automatically, so the company can't game it. And if the company can't game it, then it can't be turned into greenwash. Okay,
so measure what can be measured.
Exactly.
And the rest of the stuff you can deal with later as and when. But
exactly, go with what you know, not with what you don't know.
Excellent. All right. It reminds me of one of the things when I was running, I think, corporate business development in NatWest many years ago. Apparently, I had a catchphrase which was played back to me, and once I heard it, I thought I'm going to use this more and more now, which is right now. So when we had a discussion in our board meetings about what are we going to do, and we discuss it, and then somebody would say, "When do you want that?" I said, "I want it right now." Yeah. You know, whatever we're going to do, what's the next single step? And you know the direction, but don't worry about 100 steps. What's the next one? Let's take that action and move forward.
So the next step is definitely to start taking things from a very simple what do we know basis, because unless we do that, the regulators will take ages to come round to everybody's way of thinking. By the time the regulators and the standards have been set, we'll be 2, 3, 4 years down the line. We'll be beyond the COP26 targets and the Paris targets. So we don't have time on this.
Okay, I got one last question, and it's a bit of a curveball, but let's go for it here. We've only got a little bit of time to answer it. In the physical supply chain world, the greater the distance the goods have to travel, the greater the carbon footprint, sort of very simplistically. Traditionally, emerging markets, developing economies have been used as the factories of the world because of the low labor costs. And the price paid is the high carbon footprint. So a general trend in physical supply chains is to reduce that distance by nearshoring or onshoring, and technology has made that easier because there's less labor involved, and therefore the labor cost differential is eroding. So how do you that's, on the face of it, that's a conflict of interest. On the one hand, we're saying we need to help these SMEs in all these emerging markets and developing economies to join the digital revolution and be green and demonstrate that they are green. On the other hand, we really ought not to be relying on them to produce all the world's goods anyway, so we need to take the business away from them. So how do we resolve that conflict? I don't know who wants to take that one. That's Lionel. I'll ask my colleague to answer that one. Because
yeah, your ex-colleague. It's a conflict. But there will be these conflicts, and it means you go on both strands. You know, I mean, just-in-time manufacture has been caught out by COVID. We've seen that, and we're seeing that with the high freight costs, etc. now. So, you know, there are scenarios where people are looking at just in case and maybe moving part of what they're doing on a nearshore or onshore. But to be honest, you have to go down both strands. It's as simple as that. I don't think you stop one and then start another. I think people have to make better plans, realizing that the way they've worked before is not been the right way. So, you know, it is a quandary because, hey, there's a conflict, but there are loads of conflicts, you know, and, you know, the whole digitization, I mean, as you said before, that, you know, our, you know, clients are getting younger. They're going to expect this. This is going to happen anyway. And all the, you know, MLETR, the ICC, DSI, the ITFA, DNI, UDR, whatever it is, RTT, I can never get it right. Thank you. Yeah, these are all standards. These are all, you know, these are all standards, and they're all to facilitate. But they're not going to change the dial on ESG. No. It's what you do when you have these standards that matters. And I just want to make one point that was around, you know, we're talking about some of these developing economies. I mean, some of them don't even have the legislation in place yet that allows receivables financing. So, you know, there's, you know, so you don't stop one and start another. You just carry on all strands. And I think that's my answer to the conflict. Yeah, there's a conflict, but carry on.
Yeah. Okay. Great stuff. Let's quick round of closing comments, Ian. Just a few seconds.
Thank you, John. Yeah, just to close that point, perhaps it's worth remembering that these emerging markets and developing economies are contributing less than 1.5% to global warming. And the big contributor here is actually the transport mechanism over which they usually don't have any control. That's usually under the control of the buyers and the importers. So we also work with the Customs Union and other international bodies. And I can tell you that the projections for cleaning up the shipping industry in particular, and reducing its carbon footprint, moving from sort of dirty sulfur, high sulfur fuels to cleaner fuels, for example, is going to take, you know, this is a 10 to 20 year horizon. So this is why at the moment we tend to work with this maxim, which is you're looking for the minimum evidence to ensure legitimacy and avoid embarrassment along your supply chains, which is essentially what Rebecca was saying. We go with what we've got, and we have 280 or more sustainability and social inclusion standards on ITC's sustainability map database for a start. And then we work with what we've got at the enterprise level, or the aggregator enterprise level in these countries. And in the meantime, we need to certainly make progress on cleaning up our transportation, because over the centuries, trade has increased enormously, and it's gone from being clean wind-powered sail trade to rather dirty, high environmental impact transportation methods.
Okay, excellent. Right. Closing, literally 5 seconds each. Gunnar, closing comment.
Yeah, so I'm very optimistic. I think we know what we need to do, so let's get on with it, shall we?
Okay, Rebecca, 5 seconds.
Absolutely. Do it now. Don't overthink it. Let's just get started.
Okay, and finally, Duarte.
Agreed in full, but let's get serious about creating an infrastructure. You know, if we all need accountants and auditors to certify creditworthiness, why are we hesitating in creating the same infrastructure to enable ESG? Is this important or not?
Okay, good. Lionel, last thought.
Yeah, well, I wrote down JFDI, but I'll take the F out. Just do it. I mean, it's as simple. Just get started.
Okay, excellent. Right, I think on that note, we have overrun a couple of minutes, but hopefully we'll be forgiven for that, because the conversation was very interesting. Thank you all very, very much. I think that's been a really good discussion, and hopefully everyone that's dialed in has benefited from that. we haven't left any time for questions, but I'm sure there will be an opportunity for people to put their questions in and for the guys to respond online as appropriate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.